Hey, everybody. Glad to be here with all of you tonight. We're going to have a great conversation about vampire movies tonight, and I'll answer any questions. Should be good. Should be good. Here we go.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just it's a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
All righty. How is everybody doing tonight? Yeah, I'm glad to be here with you all tonight. Yet another late night conversation. I'm here in my lovely Brooklyn apartment, and we're going to follow our normal format. I'll give my opening remarks for tonight. After that, we'll do the roll call where I call you all out as I see you, names and locations. We find out who's on the other side of the camera. Then after that, I will answer your questions. So if you have any questions for me tonight, please send a Rumble rant if you're watching on the Rumble. You can Cash App me at Caleb Maupin 22. But the best way, the absolute best way to send questions, if you got them, is to buy me a coffee. Go to buymeacoffee.com/Caleb Maupin. You can be anonymous. You can ask a long question. It's really just the best format. And in terms of announcements, our organization is called the Center for Political Innovation. We're a great group, cpiusa.org. We're always doing great stuff to promote anti-imperialism in America. We got some exciting projects in the works, so join the Center for Political Innovation and get involved. And just to remind you, we will be following our normal format tonight, which is first the opening remarks, then the roll call, and then I answer your questions. So if you have a question, send your question. Go to buymeacoffee.com/Caleb Maupin and send your question. It can be anything. I can just talk about anything, but I need you all to ask questions, so please do so. You can also do Rumble rants, or you can Cash App me, Caleb Maupin 22. Folks, I thought I would get on here and talk about something that I know a lot about, which is vampire movies. I know a lot about it because as a young person, as a teen and preteen, that was my obsession. That was actually what I wanted to do before I got into politics. My goal was to be a screenwriter. I wanted to write vampire movies. And it's good that I didn't do that, because the kind of vampire movies I liked back then are not the kind of vampire movies that are popular nowadays. And that's a whole thing that we'll get to later in the conversation. But let's just jump right into it. Vampire movies. Vampire movies. Now, the inspiration of the modern vampire movie, the reason that we all know about them is because in 1897, there was a novel that was published in London, in England, and it was called Dracula. Dracula. And it was written by a theater employee, a guy who worked at a theater, who was an Irishman, a man of Irish descent, who lived in London, and he worked at a theater, and his name was Abraham, but he went by Bram, which was the nickname, right? You know, it was kind of a nickname for Abraham. Bram Stoker. I guess he, set up the stage and ran the lights. He was an employee of a theater where people would go to shows in London. And he had the idea to write this novel, Dracula. And it was pretty brilliant on the surface because no one had ever done that before, right? All the stuff that we now associate with vampire movies came from that. First of all, the name Dracula. Well, the name Dracula was a nickname that had been given to Vlad the Impaler, who was a Romanian, king, prince, leader, it was a slur on Vlad the Impaler. There was this guy who lived in Romania during the Middle Ages who was particularly nasty, and he would, he made a point of killing his enemies by stabbing them and putting their body through stakes. And everyone called him Vlad the Impaler, right? And people, started to refer to him as Dracula, which literally means son of the devil, right? And that was like what people called him. And he lived in Romania, in Transylvania. And apparently Bram Stoker got a book on Romanian history, or somehow he found out that some guy who lived in Romania hundreds of years before, Vlad the Impaler, had been nicknamed the son of the devil. He thought that sounded pretty badass, and he thought that's what he would name his character. And he wrote this novel, and the Dracula novel is all diary entries or letters, right? There's no narration, right? It's the letters or the diary entries of all the different characters, right? And you hear it from the perspective of Jonathan Harker, the businessman. You hear it from the perspective of Lucy, who I think is his girlfriend. And then you hear it from the perspective of Van Helsing, the vampire hunter. And there's newspaper articles, but there's no actual narration, which was quite a revolutionary thing to do back then. Back then, if you were going to write a novel, people expected that you would write, once upon a time, there was a man named Dracula. But he didn't do that. Instead, he wrote a fictional diary entry and letters, etc. So that was kind of revolutionary. And later, that became something that some of the more experimental writers like James Joyce and Gertrude Stein and others used, right? I think I read Ulysses by James Joyce, or I tried to read Ulysses when I was in high school. And a lot of Ulysses is letters and diary entries and stuff like that. That was a big change in literature that went on, during these times. And he was kind of ahead of the game, to some degree. He was a little bit ahead of the game. So there we go. So, and that was Dracula. And if you look at the Dracula novel, that was a huge bestseller. It was a smash hit, right? There was a whole field of literature they called Gothic literature, right? And even that name Gothic, what does that even mean, right? So the Goths were a Germanic tribe that fought against the Germans, or the Roman Empire. I'm sorry, they fought against the Romans, right? Before you had Europe, right? Modern Europe. You had the Roman Empire had taken over all of Central Europe, all the way up into Britain. The Roman Empire. And as the Roman Empire was falling, they battled against tribes in what is now Germany, these tribes of Germans. And among the tribes they battled, one was called the Vandals. And that's where the expression, you vandalize something, that was for the Vandals. They were known to go tear shit up. And one of those tribes was the Vandals. And there was another tribe called the Goths. And I guess it divided to the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths. Gothic meant barbaric, meant old-fashioned, it meant scary, it meant not civilized, not modern. The barbarian tribes that fought the Romans were considered to be not nice people, right? They were considered to be men who lived in the woods. They robbed people. They were like, raiders, and they were not nice people. They were scary and primitive and cruel, etc. And so in the 1800s, as they started writing novels that involved vampires and witches and scary stuff and took place in medieval times, they started referring to them as Gothic, right? And that's where that term comes from. And it doesn't even exactly match, right? That a lot of the stuff we think of as Gothic is stuff from the Middle Ages, and the Goths were before that, right? They were around the time of the fall of the Roman Empire. But Gothic, right? We talk about Gothic architecture, Gothic literature, right? It was a trend in the 1800s. You had Romantic literature that tended to be, optimistic and, making you feel good and making you feel inspired. Then you had Gothic literature that was dark, right? And Dracula was a Gothic romance, right? It was a dark story. And it's about a vampire, and it has very little to do with Vlad the Impaler, who they got the name from. And it even kind of reinvents the vampire legend, right? I guess Romania and other places, there was, superstitions about these kind of these kind of spirits that came out at night and drank blood. They tended to go after livestock, from my understanding of the Romanian superstition, was that the vampires targeted livestock, not people. They would, in the middle of the night, they would go drink the blood of the cows. But regardless, he took kind of superstitions from Romania, the nickname of a Romanian king who died, and he took that and he made it into a story, and he published it as a novel, and the novel sold like crazy. Now, I'm going to tell you why the novel sold like crazy. 1897 was the year, and this was Victorian Britain. And that at that time, there was a huge crackdown on sex, right? There was a huge crackdown on anything related to sex. They would put curtains over piano legs because they might look like human legs and you might get turned on. You weren't supposed to say the word leg. The word leg was considered too sexual. So, you would say limb. Because if you said leg, that was too sexual. It might make you think of a leg. You might get turned on by thinking about a leg. There was a huge effort in public with doctors and all this to urge people not to masturbate, right? And do not masturbate. If you masturbate, you'll go insane, etc. Sexual repression was a really, really big part of Victorian England. And so people were kind of bottling up their sexual feelings. There was a huge effort to clamp down on things that were sexual. It's during this time that men started wearing suits and ties. Prior to the suit and tie, men wore elaborate colored outfits just like women did. But starting in the Victorian era, there was a feeling that was not proper. If you were a man and you wore, a wild, crazy costume or something, or men had worn wigs during the time of the American Revolution, and prior to that, wigs and coats and all of this, that was considered improper. So the suit and tie became kind of the standard outfit, right? Victorian England. And it was around this time that Sigmund Freud rose in popularity in Austria because he was basically arguing that this sexual repression was leading to all kinds of sexual perversions, that people have sexual feelings, whether they bottle them up or not. But if they bottle up and repress their sexual feelings, they'll come out in perverted and strange ways. That's what Sigmund Freud argued, right? That if you tell people their sexual feelings are bad, if people bottle them up, they'll have them, but they'll suppress them and they won't be conscious of them. And that's how you get all kinds of perversions. That's a big point of Sigmund Freud. His writing, his interpretation of dreams came out the following year, 1898. So in this context of heavy sexual repression, this novel came out. And what's important about the novel, about the story, there's a couple things that are important about the story, but one of the main things about the Dracula novel is it is a reverse colonialism fantasy, right? Dracula, the vampire, is from Romania. The story is that a businessman, a British businessman, a respectable British businessman, goes to Romania, to Transylvania, to help a Transylvanian count, sell his property and do a business transaction. And the guy goes there and gets trapped in the castle. And the man, the Count Dracula, is actually a vampire. And he then takes his tickets and goes back to England. And this scary monster from Eastern Europe, from Romania, goes around and starts terrorizing beautiful women as they're sleeping. And biting them in the neck and turning them into vampires, etc. And basically, this is a really common theme in a lot of horror literature. Is at the time, what was going on is that, countries like Romania, countries like Yugoslavia, what is now Yugoslavia, were being colonized by the British. The British were dominating them, exploiting them economically. They were going there and taking them over and, looting their economy and, destroying them. And the idea was that lurking in the background of the mind of the colonizer is the fear that the colonized will do to them what they're doing, right? Is that what we're doing, they're going to do back. And that this is a really, really common theme with colonialism. For example, at the time of slavery, that slavery was going on in the United States, the slave masters are constantly writing about the danger of black supremacy. Right? It's like, this is slavery. Like, black people don't even have rights, but they're constantly saying, well, there could be black supremacy. Like, what? Right? And during the immediate aftermath of slavery, that was a big talking point, was, that they were the Southern racists were constantly talking about the danger of black supremacy. Well, there was no danger of black supremacy under Jim Crow, etc. But the white people all knew that the black people had it very, very bad, that they were mistreating the black people, and that whenever you harm somebody, in your mind, you will suddenly think, what if one day they did it to me? And that's just kind of a natural human response, right? That, if you hurt somebody, you may not consciously think it, but subconsciously you're going to be going, oh shit, what if someday they do to me what I'm doing to them? And it's just kind of a subconscious fear that develops, and it comes out in this literature. So this is the British public writing about, okay, we're colonizing Eastern Europe, we're going after people in Eastern Europe, and what if they do to us what we did to them? What if they come over to England and start terrorizing us? And that's what Dracula is. It's a reverse colonialism fantasy, right? At the time that the British are going into Romania and economically dominating it and looting it and exploiting it, there's a fear, what if some Romanian monster came back to London and started terrorizing us? And that's a really common theme in horror literature. The other thing that's interesting is that there was a weird fetishization of Eastern European women at the time, and Eastern Europeans in general were considered to be very sexual. For example, the word masochist. I don't know if you've ever heard the word masochist, right? There's a sadist, right? As someone who enjoys inflicting pain. There's a masochist, enjoys receiving pain. The word masochist comes from an Austrian novel. There was a novelist named Leopold Sacher-Masoch. That was his name. And he wrote a best-selling pornographic novel around this time called Venus in Furs. And it was about a woman of Eastern European descent who is like a dominatrix, and she wears fur, like dead animals. She's got like fur, and she's supposed to be wild and Eastern European, right? And it's this weird fantasy this Austrian guy wrote, and it's this like dominatrix fantasy that was really, really popular in the 1890s or whatever. And the villain, or I guess the hero, or I don't know, the sex object is this woman from Eastern Europe who's portrayed as wild and uncivilized, and she's wearing, fur of dead animals, right? It's like not fancy fur coats. It's fur in that, she lives in the woods and she killed herself an animal that she's wearing. And she's, it's like one of the first like dominatrix kind of things. And it was written around the same time. And the sex object is somebody from Eastern Europe, right? And there was a weird fetishization of people from Eastern Europe. And people say this mirrors some of the stuff that has always happened. Again, it's kind of a reverse colonialism thing. At the same time that a group of people is being colonized, they're being sexualized, they become the object of sex fantasies. We see this throughout American literature, etc. But regardless, so Dracula, and in the novel, Dracula is portrayed as this very, very good-looking man. He has a beard, right? He doesn't have a beard in any of the more, but in the 1897 novel, Dracula is this really, really good-looking, big, strong Romanian guy who has a beard. And what does he do? He comes back to London, and he breaks into the rooms of women while they're sleeping, and he penetrates them with his teeth. And it's rape porn. It's a rape fantasy. I mean, that's clearly what it is. I mean, they couldn't write a novel about some guy breaking into women's apartments and having sex with them. So they wrote a novel about a vampire breaking into women's apartments and biting them in the neck. And some of the passages in the novel make that very, very blatant. For example, one of the things that never made it, I think it was in like one of the movies, is that like at one point, Dracula takes his shirt off and bares his chest and then pierces a hole in his chest and starts bleeding out of his chest and then makes the woman drink his blood. We all know what that's supposed to be, and that it's rape porn. It's porn. It's porn, but in a highly repressed Victorian society where you couldn't have porn, where people are, covering up the piano legs or whatever.
it's highly sexually arousing. Oh my God, this is, and Dracula, again, we think of Dracula as Bela Lugosi, right? But he didn't look like Bela Lugosi. He's a big, strong Romanian guy who's breaking into women's apartments and getting, and it's all very, very sexual. It's all very, very sexual. And that's the Dracula novels. And they were a really, really big hit. And they were very, very popular, made Bram Stoker a lot of money. And Bram Stoker is not just responsible for Dracula and the vampire genre. He's also responsible for the mummy industry. Did you know this? Right? The reason that there are movies about mummies, right? The Mummy, The Mummy's Hand, The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb, all of that also comes from Bram Stoker, right? Because after he wrote Dracula, it was such a big success. He wrote another horror novel called The Jewel of Seven Stars about, somebody who goes to Egypt and steals a jewel, and the jewel makes, dead bodies come alive and eat people or something like that. And that was the inspiration for the mummy genre. So the mummy stuff comes from Dracula, from Bram Stoker as well, because he was kind of an inspiration for modern horror. And The Jewel of Seven Stars by Bram Stoker. And so, you look at that, that's the Dracula stuff. Now, movies got going, right? The first full-length movie ever made was The Birth of a Nation, which was the Ku Klux Klan propaganda film created by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, D.W. Griffith. That's the first full-length movie. World War I happens. After World War I, one country that's not doing too well is Germany. Germany really suffered. However, Berlin, right? Berlin, the capital of Germany, for some reason, at the same time that Germany was really in the shit in the 1920s, the Weimar Republic, Germany's not doing too well. For some reason, Berlin became an artistic hub, right? Berlin was where some of the greatest artists and writers were. And Berlin became the center of the film industry that was very new. Films were still silent in the 1920s. And in Berlin, you got a whole movement of filmmakers they called German Expressionism that made movies that are actually very good. One of the movies that they made is a movie that's kind of an analogy for the class struggle. It's called Metropolis, and it's like a science fiction movie about a futuristic world where there's the poor people that are enslaved and the rich people that live off of them, and they battle each other in this kind of sci-fi, and there's a robot that looks like a person. It's a great movie. There's another movie that was about hypnotism, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, that was also a really big hit. And German Expressionism. There was a film about a child predator and how the community comes together to go after the child predator. It's called M, right? And it's like there's a child predator in the neighborhood and the community comes together to kill the child predator. So, in Germany, they're doing really good filmmaking in the silent film era. And so in Germany, they made the first Dracula movie, I guess you could call it. But they couldn't call it Dracula because of the fact that Dracula is copyrighted, right? So they called it Nosferatu. And instead of Count Dracula, his name is Count Orlok. And Dracula in the novel in 1897, he's very, very good looking. Nosferatu, Count Orlok in the first vampire movie, really. The first successful major vampire movie is called Nosferatu. I believe it was made in 1924 or something like that. And he's really ugly, right? He's just horrible. In 1922, this film was made, and they hired an actor at the time who was very well known, who his name was Max Schreck. Schreck is the German word for scream, and the guy was notoriously ugly, right? And he would play villains and scary people in plays and such. And they hired Max Schreck, this very, very ugly man, to play the vampire, to play Count Orlok, and they made the first successful vampire movie, which was a big, big hit. And I'm just going to show you some of the key scenes from it. This is Nosferatu. This is like one of the big scenes in Nosferatu. It's a silent film from 1922. It's a Dracula movie, and this is Jonathan Harker shows up at the castle of Count Orlok or whatever, and here you go.
Yeah, and it was a big hit. I mean, it was a very well-made film, very scary. There are some interesting aspects to the film. One thing is that, a lot of people that, talk about the Holocaust, they talk about a lot of the things the Nazis did. They talk about how there's kind of a German cleanliness, right? The Germans don't like pests and dirty things. And there's a lot of scenes of rats in the movie. Like when the vampire Nosferatu comes to the city, right? All of a sudden there's a bunch of rats, and there's a lot of scenes of rats, right? That are like gross. People see that. And I don't know. I mean, it's 1922 Germany, and it was a German expressionist film, and it was a big hit. It was quite a success, right? And yeah, I mean, that was the first major vampire movie. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is obviously when you say Dracula, right? Everyone immediately thinks the image that comes into your mind is of the 1931, English language film starring Bela Lugosi. I'll show you. This is something that looks like this is most likely what comes to your mind when you think of a vampire. You think of Dracula. You will most likely think of this image. This is the kind of the image that has become synonymous with vampires and all this. And it was a hit movie from 1931. Let me put it on the stage here, right? On the screen, right? This is the image. This is an actor named Bela Lugosi. And Bela Lugosi played Dracula in the 1931 Hollywood movie that was a huge success. It was a huge success. America was in the middle of the Great Depression. The economy wasn't doing too good, but they made this movie, and it was a smash hit. And I've actually watched the film, and honestly, I don't find it to be that entertaining, and I'll tell you why. Most of the action doesn't happen on the screen, right? The castle at the beginning looks very neat. They did a great job with the castle, but almost all the action is off screen because it was the film version of a stage play. They had done a stage play on Broadway based on the vampire novel, based on the classic Bram Stoker novel. And so they just took the stage play and they kept basically the entire script and they made a movie out of it. Other than the castle at the beginning, it's kind of boring because all the, putting stakes through hearts and biting people in the neck, all that happens off stage because it was a stage play. On a stage play, you can just have people tell people about things. You don't have to show everything. It was originally a stage play on Broadway. It was a big hit. And then they made a movie out of it. But what's particularly interesting is Bela Lugosi was a communist. And a lot of people don't know this, but actually Bela Lugosi was from Hungary. And in Hungary, right after World War I, 1919, there was an uprising and they declared the Hungarian Soviet Republic. And Bela Lugosi was an armed fighter in the Hungarian Soviet Republic. And that for like a year, there was briefly a communist government in Hungary right after World War I, right? Germany, you had Bavaria, Red Bavaria, the Bavarian Soviet Republic, Rosa Luxemburg, and all of that. The Soviet Union was the only place that held on. But in Hungary, for about a year, there was the Hungarian Soviet Republic. And Bela Lugosi was part of it to some degree or other. He was a soldier who fought on the communist side of the Hungarian, Soviet Republic, the uprising that happened in 1919. And they lost. And so he fled the country and he came to the United States to avoid, being killed for being part of the Hungarian Soviet uprising. And so, that's how he got to America. And then he was just an actor. He was just good at acting. And he ended up acting in Broadway plays about Dracula. And he ended up being a big star in Hollywood because he played Dracula. I think that's fascinating. But yes, Bela Lugosi, the actor, was a communist who fled Hungary because he lost. He was on the losing side of an uprising. And, you would never know that, but you can look it up. It is true. He was part of the Hungarian Soviet Republic. Isn't that wild? I think that's a particularly wild, crazy story. He fought in World War I, and then at the end of World War I, the soldiers rose up and created the Hungarian Soviet Republic.
and he fought for it and lost, and he got the hell out of there. So that's Bela Lugosi. And that, you'll notice, for example, there's some big changes. For example, he doesn't have a beard, right? Dracula, the original Dracula in the novel, had a beard. You'll notice he doesn't take his shirt off, right? Dracula in the novel takes his shirt off all the time. There's some major changes there. This look, right, is what was considered to be a very, very good looking man at the time of the Great Depression, right? Beards were in style in the 1800s, but as you start getting into the time of World War I, and especially in the 1920s, beards were not considered to be popular, right? Beards were a sign that you were scruffy and vulgar and working class. Respectable people had razors to shave their faces, right? And it's this kind of like, this is the era of raccoon coats, right? This is the era of, like Harvard and Yale guys driving around in their Tin Lizzies. This is the era where, the movie stars, they had their cigarettes on these long pointers that they would like, the cigarette would be at the end. And, this is just kind of, in addition to being what we think of as a vampire, this is a 1930s Hollywood movie star. This is a really, really good looking man in the 1930s, right? He's wearing a tuxedo with a bow tie, right? He's got a bow tie on, right? You never think of Dracula wearing a bow tie. He's wearing a bow tie. He's got his hair completely slicked back, probably wearing some expensive hair product on there. He's completely clean shaven because he's a gentleman and he's fancy and rich. And, this is like a 1920s, 1930s hunk, right? This is what a good looking guy looked like back during that era. And if you think about like Hollywood stars from the 1920s and 30s, they all kind of more or less looked like that. He just happened to be playing a vampire. And I think that's particularly interesting too. We associate this look more with vampires now, but that was just kind of a really, really good looking guy back in the 1920s and 30s. This was, somebody who was very, very wealthy and drove around in a motor car and, smoked cigarettes from a long pointy thing. And, I don't know. Yeah. So that's Bela Lugosi. During the Great Depression, they made vampire films, right? That's when the horror movie genre of Universal Studios really got going. They made many Dracula sequels, many Frankensteins, etc. After World War II, World War II is when, they made a lot of horror films during World War II. That's when they made the Mummy films and such. But it was really, after World War II, American studios weren't as into making these kinds of films, but the Brits were. And in Britain, you had a small film production company called Hammer Film Productions. And they made their own version of Dracula. And they got an actor named Christopher Lee to play Dracula. This is the first Dracula film that the Hammer Film Studios ever made.
This is the story of Dracula, a creature who destroys all whom he touches. Dracula the terrifying, the feared, who sleeps in the tombs of the dead by day and arises at night to inflict his terror upon the innocent and the unsuspecting.
Oh, you must help me. You must. You're my only hope. You must.
I'll help you. I promise.
Please try and understand. This is not Lucy, the sister you loved. It's only a shell, possessed and corrupted by the evil of Dracula.
Now, that actor who played Van Helsing was also somebody who went on to be very famous. He was in the first Star Wars movie. He was a very famous British actor named Peter Cushing. So Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing were kind of the pair they had in all their horror movies. That's Peter Cushing. Dracula is played by Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing.
How do you destroy a fiend who has so far proven himself indestructible? Those who come to end his reign of terror stay to become his victims.
Castle Dracula is somewhere here in Klausenberg. Will you tell me how I get there?
You ordered a meal, sir. As an innkeeper, it's my duty to serve you. When you've eaten, I ask you to go and leave us in peace.
This is the doctor who dares to challenge the vampire Dracula. This is the anguished man who fears for the lives of his beloved, the girl who is his sister, and the one that is his wife. Dracula, the bedeviled master of all that is evil.
Now, these films, the Hammer films, what's interesting about them is that you'll notice none of that's happening off stage. You see Dracula biting people, you see stakes being driven through hearts. It's not happening off stage. There's a level of gore in it. There's a level of, good looking women and such. It's much more modern, I guess you could say. But, there's no nudity in these films. There's no sex really in these films. It's generally just, people fighting a vampire. Vampire comes, starts biting people on the neck. People are fighting the vampire. But these films were very, very, very heavily censored by the British government. The Hammer Film Production Company had endless battles with the British film censorship, bureaus. And apparently, so, the music that was playing there, dum, da dum, da 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 dum, da dum. So apparently one thing that happened was that they showed the movie to the censors without the music, right? And I guess the censors were really, really concerned that the film Dracula would promote sexual perversion. They were convinced that, it would promote sexual perversion. It would be pornographic. So they argued with the censors for a long time. And finally, the censors approved the movie and they released the movie. But the censors had approved the version without the soundtrack. And so they added the soundtrack afterwards. And the censors were furious because they felt that music that you heard was pornographic music. It was what they called sex music. Right. It's pretty wild. I don't quite get it. Right. But the censors and the British government hadn't approved the version with the soundtrack in it. And when it hit the theaters and Dracula's running around the stage, running around, biting people or whatever with bum, ba bum, they were very, very offended by that. And, Hammer Film Productions, right, with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. There was the director and screenwriter Terence Fisher, who wrote a lot of the scripts. They made these films, in Technicolor in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And these films were very low budget, and they did very, very well at the box office. People really, really liked them. And of course, at the same time, there's the 1960s cultural revolution is happening. So the standards are gradually, getting less and less. And the films gradually get more and more gory, and they gradually contain more and more nudity and sexuality, etc. But they always, end with a happy ending. The bad guy, Dracula, always loses. The good guy always wins. Dracula is terrified of the cross. The cross is the symbol of Christianity. That's what Dracula is terrified of. Good triumphs over evil. Dracula is satanic. He always dies, and they invent very elaborate ways for him to die, right? They keep having to come up with new creative ways for Dracula to die. And one of them, there's a windmill that's on fire, right? And the windmill gets into the shape of a cross. And then Dracula, the shadow of a cross goes onto Dracula and he dies. Who'd have thought, right? There's another one where Dracula falls down and he falls and there's a stake in the ground and the stake goes through his heart. They got him, right? There's kind of elaborate ways he ends up dying. And some of them, they burn him. I guess you can kill him by burning him, and he's always dying in very elaborate ways, but then he always manages in the sequel, they bring him back to life somehow. And there's usually a person, some kind of evil person who's doing something evil who brings him to life. because they're just evil and in awe of evil. And then they tend to be his first victim as the person who brings him back to life. They're always bringing him back to life. And, you know, there's many different movies from this era. Scars of Dracula. Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. One of them, this is a one that they made, I believe in 1970. What year was it? Right? What year did this one come out? In 1970. They made this film, Taste the Blood of Dracula. And I find the plot of Taste the Blood of Dracula to be very, very interesting. So 1970, this movie comes out. And I'm going to tell you, this is a little bit darker in terms of its plot than some of the other ones. But, you know, it's saying something, right? So here we go. This is Taste the Blood of Dracula. This is the trailer.
Feel the cold grip of his presence. Sense the clammy excitement of his evil. Taste the sharp fear that he alone can bring.
Dracula's blood.
This way, gentlemen.
We know the way.
These men thought they had tasted all that life had to offer.
Ready when you are, gentlemen.
Would you be willing to sell your souls to the devil?
If one thought that one's experience might be extended.
It would be extended to infinity.
There's someone there.
Dracula is back to choose his human victims.
Alice.
Who are you? How do you know my name?
Dracula is back to select his companions in darkness, who must die that he may live. If you shock easily, stay away.
She's neither dead nor alive.
Lucy! 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 Paxton! Paxton, listen to me! The mark's on her neck! She's a vampire!
Prepare yourself. Every nerve, every muscle.
No.
Prepare yourself for the greatest shock of all.
Yeah. So that one, it's 1970. It comes out. The film opens with there's this grumpy old man, right? And he's coming home from church with his wife and daughter. He's some British aristocrat or whatever, and he's a grumpy guy. He's a Scrooge. He wears a top hat and a cape, and he's grumpy. And they come in from church, and then he starts scolding his daughter for flirting. You were flirting with that young man at church. How dare you? And he's scolding his daughter, and he's being all moralistic and, you know, oh, how dare his daughter be flirting with this guy at the church? And he's just so horrified. So then, you know, after the fight or whatever, his carriage comes to pick him up, and he gets into the carriage and he goes to meet with these two other guys. And these two other guys are his buddies with whom he has some kind of satanic secret society. So this guy's a total hypocrite, right? He's upstanding and moral or whatever, but then he's secretly a Satanist with three other guys, and they have prostitutes or whatever, and they meet this man who promises he will help them sell their souls to the devil in order to enhance their experiences. And they go and do his ceremony. And as a result, Dracula comes back to life, right? They weren't really selling their souls to the devil. They were just helping the guy revive Dracula. And Dracula comes and terrorizes their daughters and family members. And, you know, it's quite a wild film, you know.
And you look at it, it's about moral hypocrisy. That's one part of it, is about hypocrisy. But it's also kind of about kind of the thrill of the forbidden. And it's also, the other thing about these movies in particular is that they're kind of, they talk now about steampunk, right? Steampunk. That's a thing that people talk about, of like Jules Verne aesthetics, right? And that, there was the film that came out a few decades ago. They made a movie called The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and it was like, it was like Sherlock Holmes, and it's like there's like a kind of a fantasy of this time period, right? When women are wearing Victorian dresses and the men are in carriages and wear top hats, and Frankenstein and Dracula and Sherlock Holmes and and the Invisible Man, and there's kind of a weird fantasy of this time, and this is clearly a it's kind of a recreation of Victorian times, kind of a fantasy that's created. I don't know. I mean, that I will say, I in particularly liked the Hammer films when I was a teen, because they were films I could get my hands on, right? I found the old black and white vampire films. I did watch Nosferatu. I enjoyed it. But the original Dracula, I didn't particularly enjoy. And then modern films, modern Dracula running around a city, and, it's almost like an action movie. I don't particularly like that. But this was like the perfect medium, right? You still have a story. It takes place in the 1800s, and there is still the good guy wins. Evil is defeated by good. There's a plot, there's characters, but there's a modern level of gore. But there's a modern level of sexual innuendo, et cetera. They're kind of the perfect medium. And I really, when I was a teen, even up into when I was in college, I found the Hammer film production, the Hammer films, not just the Draculas, but the Frankensteins, just all the Hammer films. I just really liked them. They were just kind of the perfect films. My idea of a good Friday night was to get a VHS tape of one of these films and put it in and just enjoy it. That was a fun evening for me when I was a teenager, right? As I just really kind of enjoyed these films, and I could get my hands on VHS tapes of them, and I could watch them, and I just really liked them. And they stopped making them in the late 70s. They just kind of went out of style, I guess. But Christopher Lee became a famous actor. Peter Cushing became a famous actor, and for a while, that film studio in Britain, the Hammer Film Productions company, they were just known for making these very low budget but very, very box office successful horror films. And it's kind of interesting. The other thing that's interesting, there's a couple of like weird tie-ins. One is that, have you ever seen Rocky Horror Picture Show? Hammer Film Productions had a studio called Bray Studios, and it was just like a studio that they made like a castle. That's where they filmed Rocky Horror Picture Show. They also filmed it at Bray Studios because it was just available and it looked like a castle. So if you ever watch Rocky Horror Picture Show, it's filmed at the same studio that these films are all made in. That's kind of interesting. The films get oddly political at random points. They'll make comments about drug addiction, right? They'll make, one of the films, there's a film called The Brides of Dracula, and it's about, the mother, a countess or whatever, her son has become a vampire. And there's a scene where the servant is like yelling at the mother about how her son became a vampire, and she blames it on her permissive parenting, right? And that these films are actually quite conservative. I believe Peter Cushing was a Tory. He was a member of the Conservative Party, and the films are quite, there is kind of a lampooning of moral hypocrisy, I guess, right? And but there's a conservative element to them, right? And that, it's like the kids are out of control these days. These kids are out of control these days. They're doing drugs and listening to their rock and roll music, and next thing you know, they're all going to be Satan worshiping vampires, which is, it's kind of hilarious, but it's kind of, you can kind of see that there's an element of like old-fashioned British people that are offended by the hippies. That kind of comes across in a lot of the films. And apparently that's who Peter Cushing was. He was notoriously conservative. Christopher Lee, I don't quite know politically where he stood. Christopher Lee was known to be a conservative, but one of the last films he made, if I'm not mistaken, was a film
about the founder of Pakistan. It was about a Muslim, and he made a film, honoring the founder of Pakistan and stuff. And so I don't know. It's not clear. It's not clear politically where they stood. But there's another actor, and this is kind of amusing. There's another actor that everyone thinks played vampires. Vincent Price. Vincent Price was in a lot of horror films, but he only played a vampire in one movie. Vincent Price was in many horror films, many films about vampires, but the only film in which he played a vampire was a film that came out in the 1980s called The Monster Club, right? And in that film, he plays an elderly vampire who is, who lives in Arizona. And there's a horror movie writer who's lost, and the horror movie writer finds the vampire and lets him drink his blood. In exchange for that, he takes him to this secret club where all these monsters hang out. And it's a low budget film. And then, there are 4 like movies within a movie, 4 like stories that take place there. But at the end of this low budget film called The Monster Club, the only film in which Vincent Price plays a vampire, the human, the horror writer who's there, they want to let him join. He wants to join the Monster Club. And the other monsters, the werewolves and vampires, or all the monsters there, won't allow him to join the club. So Vincent Price makes a speech about why human beings are the greatest monsters ever. And this speech is there's a lot of politics here. I don't agree with this speech, but he makes an anti-human speech, right? And this speech really has a lot to do with leftist politics. This is 1981, right? This low budget horror film, the only film in which Vincent Price actually plays a vampire. And the end of the film, he makes this speech about why the human should be allowed to join the Monster Club. Here we go.
What can he do?
What can he do? In the past 60 years, Humes have exterminated over 150 million of their own kind. No effort has been spared to reach this astronomical figure, and the methods that they have used must demand our unstinted admiration. Humes began with certain very serious disadvantages, but these they overcame with wonderful ingenuity. Not having a fang or a claw, or even a whistle worth talking about, they invented guns and tanks and bombs and airplanes and extermination camps and poison gas and daggers and swords and bayonets and booby traps and atomic bombs and flying missiles, submarines, warships, aircraft carriers, and motor cars. They have even perfected a process whereby they can spread a lethal disease on any part of this planet. Not to say anything about nuclear power. During their short history, Humes have subjected...
Did you hear that dig at nuclear power just there? He said not to say anything about nuclear power, right? Yeah. Let him continue.
What history, Humes have subjected other Humes to death by burning, hanging, decapitation, strangulation, electrocution, shooting, drowning, crushing, racking, disemboweling, and other methods far, far too revolting for the delicate stomachs of this august descendant.
I never realized he was so talented.
We don't like to boast.
I second the proposal. A member of such a talented race can only be a credit to any monster club.
Maestro, to celebrate the installation of a new member, may we hear our song?
Yeah. And now, what is that? That's 1981, right? The anti-nuclear movement is very, very big. Ronald Reagan is in the White House, and that was probably considered to be an edgy, anti-war liberal speech.
Right? He's up there talking about, all the weapons that we build, nuclear weapons and submarines, and humans are the real monsters, and nuclear power, which, how does nuclear power fit in there? Nuclear power is to provide electrification. It's not a weapon. And that is when I talk about the synthetic left, right? Like the message there is that humans are the enemy. Humans are monsters. And then there's a dig at nuclear power, which is, a form of energy. And, that's basically a Malthusian message, right? That's not, but at the time it seemed very progressive, right? It was anti-war. It was opposing Ronald Reagan and his arms race buildup. It was, and that's kind of how leftism deteriorated. Going into the 1960s, you had the new left, but you also had the influence of actual Marxism. But leftism deteriorating like that was, and at the time, there were probably loads of anti-war, anti-Ronald Reagan kind of liberal people in places like New York City and San Francisco and LA who probably applauded if they were in the theater and heard that line, right? They weren't expecting politics in the movie, but then there was this great anti-war message, but it was actually an anti-human message, right? It was that kind of pessimistic, we know big oil was funding the anti-nuclear protests, right? Because big oil thought nuclear power would put them out of business, and that the peace movement kind of became co-opted by the Eastern establishment, the big oil monopolies, and their Malthusian message, right? The technology is bad, and that human beings there's too many of us in the world, we're overpopulating. And that speech there at the end, that's not a very progressive speech. It's actually human beings are the problem. They're a cancer on the earth. They're evil. And nuclear power is bad. And, of course, this human should be allowed in the monster club because humans are far more vicious and evil than vampires and werewolves and all of that. I mean, it's kind of an anti-human message. And that's, but again, that's kind of an example. When I talk about the synthetic left, that's what I'm talking about, right? That's not Frederick Engels talking about how human beings force the environment to serve them, how man is capable of going to new heights and all that. That's a hateful anti-human message. That's the message of the World Economic Forum. That's the message of Bill Gates. And, that's the message of all the people hanging out at Jeffrey Epstein's island, right? That human beings are a cancer. Human beings are the enemy. The CIA left. I've taught you all very, very well. You've taught you all very, very well. And I'm glad that you all are appreciating this. So I wanted to just conclude my vampire films message by telling a story. About 2 years ago, I was in the New Yorker Hotel. All right. Do people know what the New Yorker Hotel is? It's a famous hotel here in New York City. And I was in the New Yorker Hotel, and I was in the lobby of the New Yorker Hotel because one of the organizations that CPI has, had a relationship with is the Unification Church, and they own the New Yorker Hotel, right? They've owned it since the 1970s. It's just their property. And I was there to meet with somebody about how we could advance peace on the Korean Peninsula, to talk about efforts to promote the Bering Sea Tunnel connecting the USA with Russia over Alaska. And I was sitting in the lobby of the New Yorker Hotel, and I looked out on this lobby full of tourists, right? People from Europe, people from across America who'd come to New York City to do tourism. And I thought to myself, this is kind of like a vampire movie. Because in the vampire movie, one aspect of the vampire movies is that in the vampire movies, you have the vampires, and most people don't know they exist. And you also have the vampire hunters and Van Helsing and all of them. And most people don't know that they exist. And most people just live their lives. And here I am. I'm sitting in the lobby of the New Yorker Hotel that's owned by a religious organization, a very anti-communist religious organization from the 1960s and 70s that is now friendly towards North Korea and wants better relations with Russia and all of that. And I'm sitting here, and it's like, and when I went out to Minneapolis, in February of last year, there were a bunch of people, 15 people outside my event screaming about, it's a cult. Oh, don't go to Caleb's event. Caleb's a weird little guy, and screaming stuff that nobody understood. And I realized that in a weird way, if you're political like this, if you're involved in politics, it's kind of like being in a vampire movie. In the vampire movie, there's this whole world of vampires and vampire hunters, the undead, the vampire hunter, that
they're stalking each other. They know each other exist. They're fighting against each other. But then there's the wider society that is just kind of going about their lives and doesn't know. And I realize that's kind of how, unfortunately, politics in our time is, right? That if you get involved in anti-imperialism and the struggle for justice, people will know who you are. Certain people will know who you are and oppose you. And you'll make friends in very, very strange places. And your friends will know who you are. And your enemies will know who you are. But most people will just kind of be living their lives, just like all the people in the lobby of the hotel. I'm thinking this hotel is literally owned by a religious organization. I'm thinking, I'm somebody, I've been on doing anti-imperialist stuff. I've interviewed multiple presidents and, I've done, and all this, but, I'm just somebody here in this hotel. These people have no idea. No one, they don't know who owns this hotel. They don't know who I am. And I looked at this and I thought, this is kind of like a vampire movie. And I kind of smiled. Right. And unfortunately, to be involved in the kind of stuff that we're involved in and the kind of politics that we're in, it puts you in this kind of marginal space in America. Right now, where you are well known by people who don't like you, and you're well known by your own little universe. But beyond that, most people are just kind of indifferent, right? And that was interesting to me, and it made me think, right? And like, what does that mean, right? And at the end of the day, we do want to get out of this space, right? We want to organize the American people in their millions to build a movement to rescue America from imperialism. But we cannot continue to exist as part of this Western colonial system that is grinding nations into poverty, that is, puts profit over people. We need to break out of the dying globalist imperialist order rooted in colonialism. And we need a government of action to fight for working families. But right now, if we have the understanding that that's what we're doing, on the one hand, we will connect with all people like all of you that are watching, great people who get it. And on the other hand, we'll be stalked by the enemy. The enemy will know who we are, but most people will be kind of indifferent, right? And that it's kind of like a vampire movie. And I just finished, my new book should be available very soon. But when I was writing it, one big part of the book, right? I spent a lot of time talking about Vladimir Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg and how they opposed World War I, right? And the major socialist parties of Europe all sold out and supported World War I, right? And World War I was a horrendous war. 20 million workers were sent to their deaths. And so Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht and a few other people, a few other socialist leaders had the courage to oppose World War I. And Switzerland was neutral in World War I. And so they all went to Zimmerwald. If people ever heard of this, Zimmerwald, right? It's this little tiny town in Switzerland. And they met at a hotel, and all the anti-war socialists of Europe gathered at Zimmerwald to sign a manifesto opposing World War I. And this is an actual photo of the Zimmerwald meeting, where they gathered at this tiny, tiny little hotel in Switzerland, and signed a statement opposing the war. And that's Lenin, right? That's Lenin. And there's Rosa Luxemburg, with her hat on there. And I mean, that was it. That's all of them. And they gathered at this tiny, tiny hotel in the Alps of Switzerland, in the middle of nowhere. And they signed a manifesto opposing World War I. I'll actually show you a picture of the hotel where they gathered to oppose World War I. This is the Zimmerwald, hotel. Right. This is where they gathered this is their hotel they went at. Not a very big hotel, right? Look at that. Not a very big place, surrounded by mountains and all of that. And Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg and all of them gathered at this hotel, the Zimmerwald Hotel, in the middle of nowhere. And they signed a manifesto saying that we will not support either side in World War I. This is an imperialist war. There's nothing to gain for the working people. And you got to think about it. They went there with fake passports, right? They went there in hiding, and it's almost like a vampire movie, right? Like, think about it. It's almost like a vampire movie, right? Like they were They were the vampires or the vampire hunters that most people were just living their lives, didn't know anything about. There were probably people sitting on the train next to them who had no idea who they were, right? You know, just normal Swedes, you know, like, oh yeah, there's another guy going someplace. And here these were the people that were going to gather to sign their manifesto. And the guy in, you know, the bald guy there ended up becoming the leader of Russia. And the story goes that as World War I progressed, Lenin was against World War I, and he stayed in Switzerland. And he lived somewhere near there. He didn't stay at the hotel where they met, but he lived somewhere in Switzerland. And one day, Lenin was just hanging out in Switzerland because, you know, he couldn't go to any country that was aligned with Germany. He couldn't go to any country that was aligned with America and Britain and France. So he was just hanging out in Switzerland where it was neutral, giving directions to the Bolsheviks back in Russia. One day, Lenin got a knock on his door. And that knock on his door was from Alexander Parvus. And who was Alexander Parvus? Alexander Parvus was a member of the German parliament who had betrayed Lenin, was born in Russia, was a friend of Lenin's, who had stabbed Lenin in the back and joined the German Social Democratic Party, gotten elected to the parliament, right? This guy, Alexander Parvus, who had been the personal mentor of Leon Trotsky. Right, let me find the picture here. Parvus, Alexander Parvus, right? Trotsky's mentor, who'd stabbed Lenin in the back, right? And moved to Germany, gotten elected to the German parliament, and become a German intelligence officer. All right, so Lenin is somewhere in the Alps, all by himself, right? In Switzerland. He just had a meeting with these people, and he's just hanging out in Switzerland. One day, his old friend who stabbed him in the back and is supporting World War I on the German side knocks on his door and says to him, hey, we really want Russia to pull out of World War I, and we'd like to arrange for you to go back to Russia. And we can arrange a sealed train car, so no one will know you're in the car. Right? The doors will be sealed, so no one will see you going by. We'll arrange for you to go back to Russia. And we'll give you some resources, some money. We don't know how much money they received. And, you know, Russia, the Tsar, just abdicated and stepped down, and there's strikes and all that going on. And you're against World War I. All the other socialist groups in Russia are in favor of World War I, but you're against World War I. And yeah, we stabbed you in the back. Yeah, you hate me. I'm a traitor. I work for the German imperialists. You know, I've defamed you and spit all over you. But I'm here to tell you, Mr. Lenin, buddy, we'll send you back to Russia. You know, if you can go back to Russia and promise us you're going to make as much trouble as you possibly can. I mean, you just got to go up there and make sure Russia loses World War I, cause all kinds of problems. Can you do that? Can you go back to Russia and make World War I, you know, impossible to fight, have the soldiers going on strike and refusing to fight? Can we do that? Can we arrange a train for you? And Vladimir Lenin said yes. And he got on that sealed train. And the rest is history, isn't it? Isn't that interesting, folks? And so when you think about the vampires and the vampire movie, you never know who you might be sitting next to. You really never know who you might be sitting next to. You really never know with any of this. You know, you really never know who you're talking to. And that, you know, we always think of big things and big, important historical figures as being completely far away from us, as people that we would never meet, as people that live in this alternative universe. That's not always true. That's not always true. Right? And that a lot of times we walk by people and we walk by things that are very important and we don't even know it. And that history doesn't happen somewhere else as we observe. History happens all around us. And so on that note, names and locations, folks, names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations, names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Who is with us? Who is with us? Names and locations, names and locations. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Who's with us? Anybody? We're doing our roll call.
Names and locations, names and locations. We got Bill in Tasmania, Jacob in Wisconsin. Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us? Names and locations, names and locations. Who's with us? Who's with us? Who's with us? Names and locations, names and locations. Who wants to debate me? With who? What are you talking about? Names and locations. Anybody, anybody, names and locations. Just waiting for names to come in. All right. It's weird. I see names in the and locations, names and locations. Caleb, says Charles. Can you all hear me? Liverpool, UK. John in Florida. Jane in New Zealand. Rise from Adelaide, Australia. Can you all see me? Did I fade out for a minute? Did my internet go out or something? Am I still, you all still seeing me? You all still seeing me? There was a 5-second lag, says Charles. A 5-second lag. Okay, you're good now. Interesting. Weird. My name is gray, like it was deleted. I'm not deleting you, Jacob. I can see you. I can see you. I didn't delete your name. Jacob in Wisconsin. I saw your name when it came in. I had some buffering for a bit, says Irene. Good to see you, Irene. And yeah, Lars, Meridian, California. Mark in Utica, New York. Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us? Who is with us? Loud and clear. Robert in New Jersey. Robert in New Jersey. Good to see you, Mr. Robert. Good to see you. Names and locations, names and locations. Cameron in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Good to see you, Cameron. As always, anyone else? Names and locations, names and locations, names and locations. Anybody else? Anybody else with us tonight? Anybody? Boris and Napton. All right. Very, very good. I think you missed me, said Ryan Clark. Well, I always miss you when you go away, Ryan, but I'm glad you're back. You're a good friend of ours. Ryan's a good guy. I've met Ryan a few times at our events around the country. You know, we got a good crew of people with CPI. I really like this, you know, book we did of the CPI conventions, and it's for the members, you know, and we're doing another one for this year. It's really important to just document what we do, you know, and, yeah, good things are happening. Samuel in the Far East. Yeah, a whole bunch disappeared. The lag messed up everything. I meant my name, LOL. It's all right, man. It's all right. It's all right. Do you think it's more acceptable to work with anarchists or Nazbols for revolutionary purposes? Well, generally, I do ask that people send a Rumble rant, you know, if they're going to ask a question. But there is no such thing as a Nazbol. Lawrence, there is no such thing. Okay. And there just isn't. Nazbol is something made up by liberal pro-imperialist synthetic leftists to smear and defame people that are anti-imperialist, right? There are Nazis, right? Eric Stryker is a Nazi, but for a while he was saying he was a Nazbol. He's just a Nazi, right? He's just a Nazi. You talk to him, he's not, you know, Nazbol was a political party in Russia in the 1990s that doesn't exist anymore. You know, and there are no Nazbols, right? It's just a slur or a hysteria created by internet liberals. That's really all it is. So you're asking, is it more acceptable to work with, like, you know, I don't know, to do what, right? I think the question isn't who it's acceptable to work with. I think the issue is, what are you trying to accomplish, right? You know, if I was trying to stop a war and some anarchists wanted to stop it with me, I would do that. If I was trying to stop a war and somebody that you consider a Nazbol wanted to stop it with me, I'd be fine with that. But if I was just trying to, you know, reinforce the status quo or cancel somebody, I wouldn't work with either side, right? I think the issue is more about what you're trying to do, you know, and that none of this really means anything. One point that I've come back to many, many times on these streams is that in time periods like this, all the major ideologies divide. You know, in the lead up to the Second World War, you know, Black nationalism and Black activism in New York City divided. You had Father Divine and the Nation of Islam. In the lead up to the Second World War, conservatism in Britain divided. You had, you know, the moral rearmament and the Oxford Group, and you had the British Union of Fascists, both ultra-conservative and patriotic, but on opposite sides. In America, you had Trotskyism or the Communist Party, and they preached basically the same thing, but they were on the opposite sides. Some people were aligning with Roosevelt, and some people were aligning with Hitler.
and every major movement divided. And that's the time period that we're living in now, right? There are libertarians that want peace with Russia and don't want World War III. There are libertarians who defame and smear anyone who wants peace with Russia, and while claiming libertarianism, go along with it. There are leftists, the majority of them, that want World War III with Russia, that have Trump derangement syndrome, that support the FBI, etc. And there are leftists who oppose that. There are conservatives who, have just gone along with all the awful things Trump has done and stopped, demanding anything. And there are conservatives like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tucker Carlson and others who have challenged it, right? And are willing to, to demand protection of our civil liberties, oppose continued support for Israel, etc. And that's the issue, right? Is that there are people with every ideological label, but where do they stand on the real issues, right? Anyone can say they're anything. But the question is, what side are you on? There are real struggles taking place right now over our continued right to speak and say what we want, freedom of speech, over the danger of a new world war, over economic development or continued degrowth and Malthusianism. There are big divides in our society right now. And where do you stand? Where do you stand? That's the issue. That's the issue. Now, at this point, I do want to remind people that there is, if you want to ask a question, you need to send in a buy me a coffee. You need to go to buymeacoffee.com and, / Caleb Maupin and buy me a coffee. And someone sent one in already anonymously, right? Which is cool, right? And that's something they have the right to do. I will answer that question, but I want more people to send questions in because that's what makes all of this happen, right? Tonight, I didn't want to talk about the news. I looked at the news. People are still fighting over the Super Bowl halftime show. I already told you what I all think about that, which is, whatever. And also, I guess the Nancy Guthrie, who's like the mother of somebody who's like a TV host, was kidnapped, and that's a big story. And, I just looked at the news. I just didn't see much that was worth my time. And we like to talk about, history and stuff. I just thought I'd talk about vampire movies. What the heck? Right. What the heck? Right. So we talked about vampire movies. Right. There we go. Right. Why not? Why not? So we talked about vampire movies for an hour, and now I'll answer any questions that you all have. So yeah, should I put on some music while I wait for you all to send in some questions? Maybe that's what we'll do. We'll put some music on. What music should I put on? We'll put on some music. You all got to send some questions in. Yeah. I like to put on videos of stuff that CPI has done in the past. We had a great rally for Ibrahim Traore, right? That was pretty cool. Wonder if I could put that on. Do we have the video of that? The Traore rally that we did. Maybe I can put that on, right? I like to show the stuff that we've done in the past. Yeah. All right. This is the rally we did in Rockford, Illinois last year during the 7-day program to support Ibrahim Traore. So here we go.
In Rockford, Illinois, and we're here to say that Ibrahim Traore is right and AFRICOM is wrong.
Hands off Traore! Hands off Africa! Hands off Traore! Hands off Africa! Hands off Traore! Hands off Africa! Hands off Traore!
Today we're speaking about Ibrahim Traore, all the good things he has done. He is actually a leader that's provided true inspiration, not just for his people of Burkina Faso, but for everyone around the world.
Are in the belly of what is happening around the world. We get up, we go to work, we go home, we get online. We pretend like we don't know, but we do know. We feel the crushing imperialist boot on our necks, and can we get it off? Yes, we can!
Yes, we can!
Fuck yeah!
Fuck yeah!
We can!
Yes, we can!
Don't let them stop you!
Ibrahim Traore is the captain, president, Ibrahim Traore, the traditional president of Burkina Faso.
I think he's a remarkable leader for the whole world. Whenever I see him, I'm really compelled by him.
Taking hands off of Ibrahim Traore, and we're representing the Center for Political Innovation because we want economic development. We don't want degrowth.
People are liking it, huh?
Yeah, a lot of people are receptive or at least curious.
And I think if we take an example like this, and stand up for countries like this and learn from it, we too have a better prosperity, not just for ourselves now, but for generations to come.
So unique and so different from the various other leaders of the world. He's amazing to me.
Down with NATO! Down with NATO! Hands off Africa! Hands off Africa! Down with NATO! Down with NATO! Hands off Africa! Hands off Africa! We are an energized group fighting for working families. We are an energized group fighting for the world. We want this message to get out to everyone, far and wide, to get off your butts, to make it happen. We are one because we are in this fight together.
We've got Africa's Flame, Ibrahim Traore, the current president of Burkina Faso, who's doing beautiful, amazing things, building up the country for his people.
They kicked out the French. They formed an alliance with Mali and Niger. Security defense, economic defense. Traore is leading an agricultural revolution. They are training soldiers to be farmers. They're training farmers to be soldiers. And he's a Muslim. And it is now a crime in Burkina Faso to stir up religious division that undermines the unity of the country.
So we're supporting a real role model here.
Let me tell you a little bit about this man, Ibrahim Traore. This man is not only a leader for Burkina Faso who cares about the people of Africa and the people of the world, who's standing with Russia, who's standing with the people of the world against U.S. imperialism. And it's because that he's doing that they've made so many attempts on his life.
I would be willing to put my life on the line for him, to protect him, because he represents hope. He represents true hope and progress in this world, and I pray to God that nothing happens to him.
And my question is this: where does value come from? Where does value come from? They want you to think value comes down from the sky. They want you to think value comes from Wall Street derivative ripoff schemes. They want you to think value comes from Facebook likes and shares and hits. They want you to think value is magical. But the answer to where value comes from is within you. It is within you. It is your human labor power and your creativity. That is the source of all wealth in this world.
Yes.
And if we want to have a strong economy, we need to invest in human beings, invest in people, invest in children so they grow up and get an education and become strong and powerful and effective and smart. We need to invest in communities. We need to invest in families. That is the future.
Freedom. I think of economic growth. I think of someone who truly cares about the needs of the people and not the top 1% or the top 0.01% or whatever it is, which is the rest of the world seems to be focused on in the West anyway. We need economic development for everyone, not just for the people at the top. And that's the kind of system we're living under, why people are struggling so much.
We are here to proclaim that we will not be stopped. We will not let the imperialists threaten us. We will not let them intimidate us. We are CPI and we are here to fight for Africa.
Yeah. Like you guys in the US, ourselves in Australia, we're being held back by big finance, and we need to have a government of action that fights for working families and ordinary working people.
Investing millions and millions of francs to revamp stadiums and hold games for youth sports so they can be healthy and strong and they can build an identity of their own in working together. Ibrahim Traore was a soccer player himself, and he just held a very friendly game with other professional soccer players, and he won 3 matches. How about that? Go Traore!
Go Traore! let all nations have self-determination and develop peaceful relationships, peaceful trade with each other, and innovate and share that innovation with each other so that we can live in peace, prosperity, and harmony, because there is plenty to go around.
This is the model of what can be here. You must fight. You must get up. You must be brave. Don't let them tell you that your words have no meaning, that they'll throw you in jail if you speak up. The more of us that speak up, what happens? Then more speak up, and more speak up. Don't let that frighten you. Get off your butts, do something about it. Fight for a future that you want.
We need a world where people refuse to take advantage of the downtrodden. We need to take an alternative road, because the road we're going is leading us to nowhere but to oblivion.
And this leader in Africa is a leader who understands that. And that is why he is investing in his people. He is providing free health care to mothers in the hospital. He is providing university education to his people. Not only is college free, but while you're there, you get a stipend, a paycheck, so you can focus on your studies. You don't have to work. Imagine that. The young people of Burkina Faso, in a way, are richer than all the young people in America. You're going to be in student debt for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, 20 years. In Burkina Faso, not only do you not go into student debt, but on top of that, you get a paycheck while you're there so you can pay your bills and focus on your studies. He is enabling millions and millions of people to rise up from poverty, to launch their own farms, to pave their roads. Fisheries are opening up. Pineapple orchards are opening up. There's a pro-growth president who invests in human beings and invests in his people.
There's nothing more important right now happening in the world than what's happening right here in the belly of the beast, in the belly of imperialism. Can we make this happen? Yes. Yes, it can happen.
What we need is a win-win situation where we can find an economic system where deals or contracts whereby what makes America prosper also makes our trading prosper.
Better world is possible, but understand, if we don't believe that, if we listen to those who tell us that nothing is possible, then that's what we will get. We will get nothing.
Off Africa. Hands off Africa.
What can I say about imperialism other than the fact that it is a crushing force that is now taking its way from the tentacles of the United States and around the world, sucking the resources from other countries, impoverishing them, degrowing them, crushing them, making sure that they can't become everything that they have dreamt of being.
Organizations such as the Center for Political Innovation, it's critical to spreading the awareness, the knowledge of leaders such as Ibrahim Traoré.
And right now we don't have a government that invests in people. We have a government that invests in destroying people. A government that invests in bombs and tanks and weapons and prisons for profit. A government that defends drug cartels. A government that arms terrorist groups. And that is not the way forward. There's a small group of very, very rich people who sit at the top of the world. They've decided that the only way they can keep their throne, keep themselves at the top, is to stop human progress. And they're wrong, because there is no limit to growth. There is no limit to growth. Human creativity and brilliance is unlimited. And we can build and we can construct.
We got books! We got books!
I saw two cars pull up at the stop sign, and then they had their lights, they were flashing to get our attention. And then I saw a fist come out, and then I was like, oh yes, there's somebody who absolutely understands what we're doing. And then I saw a woman come out, and she started honking her horn, and then I didn't know there was a car behind her, and then we just started cheering. They were just honking. I heard them say thank you, because now they know what we're about, what we were doing, what we're standing for, why we're out here on this road, getting the attention of those who pass by. So they all honked. The car behind them came out and they honked as well. And they seemed extremely supportive, very happy that we're out here bringing awareness, you know, in a place where, likely of all places, which you see a big giant sign, a big, poster of Ibrahim Traoré. But here we are, CPI, bringing awareness, making it happen, and understanding that people, the more we do this, it'll catch fire.
and it seems as though it already has.
I think, yeah, there's been a number of people that have positive reactions to our rally, to the banner, to our chants, to our speeches.
We will march together, we will fight together, no matter who you are, no matter what political persuasion, no matter what race, because we are all here fighting a class struggle that is more than the sum of its parts. We are one.
But I think if we're getting positive reactions like that out here, that's a very good sign. And it's a sign of progress, and it's a sign that people are starting to wake up.
Abraham Traore is working with Russia Bad! Russia Bad! Oh my God, Russia Bad! No, Abraham Traore went to the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II in Russia, and he got to see their equipment, and he got to see their spirit of unity and their spirit of cooperation, and how they were able to defeat fascism, which we've never forgiven them for. So, also, Abraham Traore is investing in education for his students to go to Russia. And Russia has students coming to Burkina Faso so they can learn each other's culture and they can build peaceful nuclear energy.
Yay!
Peaceful nuclear energy.
Peaceful nuclear energy. Yep, that was our great rally. We're having the convention August 15th in Chicago, and we're going to do the 7-day program where we do little rallies like that and have classes and all that. We're going to do that as well. That'll be August 12th through the 19th, so that's going to be very exciting. So, yeah, join the Center for Political Innovation. We're a great group. We're always doing great stuff. So, a couple questions have come in. If you do have a question, buy me a coffee is the best way to send it. You can also do Rumble rants, etc. Now, one Rumble rant came in and then it disappeared. So Hempcar sent me the link to his Facebook to read it. And he wrote, and then it disappeared. The Club of Rome said one of their documents that humanity itself is the enemy. The former chief scientist at NASA, Langley Dennis Bushnell, called humans a contamination. Yeah, well, that's what the Malthusian ideology believes. It believes the problem is not the irrational economic system that has outstripped the narrow restraints of human beings have outstripped with their creativity the narrow restraints of the profit system. The problem is just human beings themselves, and this concept of non-productive consumers or useless eaters that lies at the center of the Malthusian ideal, right? Whereas we need a government that invests in people and views human beings as the source of all wealth and of progress. And so, yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. That's what we're up against. We're up against Malthusian ideology that views human beings as the problem, not the solution. And that we have a state that is actively carrying out Malthusian. We need not to just get the government out of the way, which is what a lot of libertarians believe. We need a pro-humanity government. A government that invests in communities and invests in people. That's what the Center for Political Innovation and the innovationist ideology is all about. We need a pro-humanity, pro-growth government, a government of action that'll fight for working families and invest in communities. Now, two Buy Me a Coffees have come in. The first one is anonymous, and it says, if Russia wants to send more oil to Cuba, ? Seems like Venezuela isn't able to, their hands are tied. Apparently some middleman sold to Israel. Mexico is being wishy-washy. Scheinbaum's hands are tied. I don't know what they'll do. This reminds me of the Zimbabwe national emergency. I don't know why it reminds you of Zimbabwe, but yeah, what Trump is doing, trying to prevent Venezuela or to prevent Cuba from getting any oil is awful. And I mean, he's just really just trying to harm the Cuban people. I mean, this is an escalation of the blockade like we've never seen. And I hope that Cuba is able to get some oil soon, right? And that, I mean, it's just abominable, right? If they're not doing one thing, they're doing another. They're kidnapping the leader of Venezuela. Now they're trying to isolate Cuba and prevent them. I know a friend of CPI who was at our recent event just organized a very good rally in Miami, and I'm hoping that we can get some pictures of it up on the website. But Cuban Americans protesting, demanding that they, not, block Cuba from getting the oil, and that they end this embargo that's making life very, very difficult for the Cuban people. I mean, they're just putting the screws on the Cuban people now, viciously, absolutely viciously. Right? It's just absolutely awful. The other question that came in was from Checkpoint Charlie, and he said The Salem's Lot, a 1979 miniseries. He says, when I was 10 years old, my sister made me watch it. The scariest scene to me was when the older brother was tapping on the window to get his kid brother to open it. I have not seen that. I know it's based on a Stephen King novel, and Stephen King is an interesting character. His politics are awful, especially on Ukraine, and I mean, he's just a liberal. But there's like new left themes in some of his novels. I read Hearts in Atlantis. There's a lot about the anti-war movement and stuff. And there's kind of like vaguely liberal stuff. And that he's from a very low income family in New England, right? And we don't think about that. When we think of New England, we think of Boston, right? We think of like wealthy Harvard, kind of like small town liberals and college professors. We think of, but actually there's a lot of poor people in Maine, a lot of poor people in Vermont, in the rural areas of Vermont. Not everyone in Vermont is Bernie Sanders or a Burlington hippie. There's a lot of poor people in Vermont. There's a lot of poor people in New Hampshire, right? That we think of like wealthy people in New Hampshire as representing all of New England, but there is a layer of poor people, and that's Stephen King, and that his novels often take place in like rural parts of New England. And have like very, very poor, low-income white people from New England, right? We think of poor white people as being in the South. We think of poor white people as being in the Midwest, but actually there is a lot of New England poor people. I remember I particularly liked the film Carrie. I actually particularly liked it. And it's interesting because I don't know if I like it now, but I was a little more bitter when I was a younger person. Like the 1970s movie of Stephen King's novel Carrie is interesting, and that it's about this girl who has a religious fanatic mother, and she's bullied, and she's bullied very nastily, and she has psychic powers, and I don't know. And what's interesting is I look back on the movie Carrie now, and I realize after the Columbine massacre in America, there was all this stuff in the media saying the Columbine massacre had been caused by bullying, right? That these Columbine kids, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, that they had been bullied. And so they took revenge on the bullies by shooting up their school. That's not what happened. That's actually not true. One of the Columbine shooters was a bully himself and was a sociopath who bullied other people. And the other of the Columbine killers was someone who was intellectually disabled and just kind of went along with this kind of sociopathic person who kind of took him under his wing. And that usually school shooters are not victims of bullying. But Carrie, right? She's a victim of bullying. She uses her psychic powers to get revenge and on all her classmates. And it's like I feel like there's probably a lot of people who have a fantasy of that. They got bullied and they have like a fantasy. So this whole narrative from the 90s or from the late 90s, early 2000s of like kid gets bullied in high school, so he goes back to school and kills all of his classmates. That just didn't happen. It's just not real, right? But the movie Carrie shows that even before there was school shootings, there were, Stephen King made a movie, wrote a novel about it, and they made a movie, and this fantasy, the like bullied revenge fantasy, has been in the American psyche long before, and that on the anniversary of the Columbine massacre, there was an article that was floating around. Everything you know about Columbine is wrong. And it's true. Everything you know about the Columbine massacre is wrong. They were not members of the trenchcoat mafia, right? The only day they were ever seen in trench coats was the day that they came and shot up the place because they hid their guns in their coats, right? They didn't listen to Marilyn Manson, right? They didn't. They were fans of Rammstein, which is a German goth metal band. They were not fans of Marilyn Manson. They blamed Marilyn Manson for the whole thing. There were just so many, we were just told so many lies. They weren't bullied. That didn't happen. Just everything we were told about it just wasn't true.
you know, we were just lied to endlessly about that incident. So it makes me wonder if the Carrie movie is part of where the fantasy, and there were good things that came out of that. They passed a lot of anti-bullying laws after the Columbine massacre, and that's good. I mean, I'm glad that, that they're, not letting kids be traumatized by other kids that are mean to them. But at the same time, like, that the massacre didn't have anything to do with bullying. That just didn't happen, right? The other thing that's weird is you get like Marty Walsh and some of these like conservatives now who think bullying is a good thing. And they don't seem to understand what bullying actually is. They seem to think bullying is, is just, telling people what you really think or something, right? Marty Walsh and some of his stuff on the trans stuff and all, he says bullying needs to be brought back. Bullying is good. It's like, dude, you don't know what you're talking about. That's not cool, right? Kids shouldn't be beating up other kids. Kids shouldn't be ridiculing and shaming and just being cruel to other kids. It's not a good thing. And bullying is very common nowadays. This idea that bullying is gone. No, it's actually very common now. It's just done with computers, right? They're not hitting each other in school as much anymore. They're being nasty. They're cyberbullying each other. They're canceling each other. They're spreading rumors about each other on the line. They're making fun of each other's appearances online. Kids are still bullying each other. It's just, it's more technologically advanced, right? It's more high technology. So yeah, when I hear conservatives say that, I agree a lot more with conservatives than I ever thought I would, right? I mean, I used to just be such a far left guy, and here I am. The left has just lost their minds and all that, but I'm not a conservative. I don't believe in free market capitalism, and I'm like, and people are saying things like bullying is good. No, it's not, right? And if you actually know what bullying is, you wouldn't say that, right? It's like, there is this weird, empathy for the overdog that is a big part of American conservatism, right? The weakness of the left in a lot of cases is it kind of glorifies victims and it gets into this like victim thing. I want to be a victim. I'm a victim, but the problem of conservatism is it's the opposite. They can't ever feel any sympathy. And I remember there were conservatives, some of the conservative people at my college that I would argue with and get to know. It was almost like if they had empathy for somebody who was being mistreated, whether it was because of their race, whether they were poor or whatever, if they had sympathy for somebody, that was too dangerous for them. And it was like, they were really trying to not sympathize with people they perceived as downtrodden because they feel that might open the floodgates to them feeling sorry for themselves. And it was like a defense mechanism. And I thought that was interesting. I don't see that as much anymore. Or maybe you do. Maybe it just depends where you go. And the other thing is now conservatives tend to think of themselves as downtrodden too, right? They're victims of cancel culture, that people lose their jobs for supporting Trump. That's a very new development too, right? So politics has changed so much, right? But the world is always changing. And that's why old formulas don't work, right? That's why we're the Center for Political Innovation. Nothing makes sense. We're in a very, very strange place. We're in a very, very strange place, but we just got to go ahead and we got to do what's right. And we got to promote optimism. We got to oppose the danger of a new world war. We've got to oppose the emerging low-wage police state. And we need to fight for working families. And if we do that and you call it left, fine. If we do that and you call it right, fine. If we do that and you can call it whatever you want, but that's what it is. And when I was a communist for many years, that was my motivation. And now that I'm an innovationist, that is my motivation. And there's a lot of people calling themselves communists now, and that's not what they're doing. We're in interesting times. And so I do want to thank you all for being here. And if there's any more questions, I will answer them, but I don't see any more questions that have come in. It was fun. Got on here for not even 2 hours, just an hour and 45 minutes, talked about horror movies. Glad you all are here. I love my community. You all are awesome. I'll be back probably tomorrow night. Tomorrow night we have our members check-in, so it's a little bit later. I'll probably start this a little bit later tomorrow night, but I'm going to do it. Keep an eye out for my new book. The announcement should be up shortly. Dare to struggle, dare to win, guys. I love our community. Center for Political Innovation is doing awesome stuff. We are the future. And get involved. If you haven't joined already, you're missing out because we are doing great stuff. Dare to struggle, dare to win. Join the Center for Political Innovation.
New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.